This will hopefully be a brief walkthrough of how to set up Craft 3 locally on a Mac with MAMP Pro. It seems that there's some confusion around it, and definitely there is when it comes to using Composer with MAMP. So the first thing I want to say is that if you're using MAMP and you don't have your terminal set up to work with MAMP, if that topic has never come up with you, then avoid the Composer approach because it will just cause a lot of headaches. What we'll do is we'll download the archive file manually. So I'm going to jump to this point in the instructions here. Here's a couple links, and I've already downloaded it to my desktop. So I'll go ahead and decompress this zip file, and we'll throw it into Sublime Text so that we can see everything. And let's go back to the instructions. There's this really important tip for Mac users. Don't lose the hidden files. And I'll just show you what that means. Here in Sublime Text, any IDE will show you your hidden files, which start with a dot. By default, your Finder does not show you hidden files which start with a dot. So if I were to grab all of these to drag them to another folder to use them, I'd be missing this .env file and that .env example, which could be really important. So this tip shows us that there's a keyboard shortcut, Command-Shift period, Command-Shift dot. So what I'll do is go over to my Finder and Command-Shift dot, and now I can see the hidden files. And if you don't like that, you can just do it again. They'll disappear. You can basically toggle the view. And what I recommend is go ahead and leave them all visible. Now when you drag them somewhere else, you have all 15 files. That's pretty important. So let's go back. Directory structure, and this is just to make sure you have all the files you need. It should look like that, and it does, so that's totally cool. Step 2, file permissions. With MAMP, you don't really have to deal with this if you do this. Go over to under ports, and I run my servers as my logged in user, and I'm Sam. That's my logged in user up here. And that user has permission to write to all the folders, so there shouldn't be a problem there. So we'll go down here to set up a security key. We can do it manually. Now, if you use Composer, you don't have to do that, but we're not using Composer. So we have two options. One is to set the key manually, and it's a good idea to use a password generator like 1Password, or we could do it from the terminal. Craft has a little utility command line thing that will do this for you, but I'm going to set it up manually in this case. So I'm going to open up 1Password. I'm going to go to password generator and just generate a password here. I don't know, 40 characters long. That sounds good. And we'll go to the .env file as it said and pop this in the security key value right there. And I'll talk more about this .env file in a minute. Great. Step 4 and step 5 are to create a database and set up a web server. But with MAMP, we can do that all in one shot. So let's go ahead and do this. Before I do, I want to show you my configuration. And as long as we're looking at ports, let's look at ports here. This is important. If you just installed MAMP, it's probably set to these defaults right here. Port 8888 for Apache, which I'm going to use for the server, not Nginx. In fact, I recommend that if you don't know how to set up Nginx for pretty URLs. And then your MySQL server is going to be on a different port. That's because you might have MySQL already running on that port, on the standard port. Apache might already be running somewhere else on a standard port. The truth is, if you're just a MAMP user on a Mac, the odds are pretty low that that's the case. So I'd just recommend going with the standard ports. And then let's look at PHP real quick. I use this individual PHP version for every host. And that lets you choose which PHP version you want to use for individual hosts here. And I've had trouble going to the identical PHP version, just problems I couldn't solve. So no big deal, just go back to this. And then it might seem very tempting to speed up PHP because the local, like your local instance might seem a little slow. But definitely leave this off because this can lead to very difficult to debug bugs. So slow and steady is what I think. And then the next thing is that you want to bump up your PHP any values for resource limits. We'll use 7.2.1 today. And so go to File, Edit Template, and go to PHP any. And the version we'll use is this. And I'm already down here at line 370 something here. It says resource limits. What you want to do is go down here. This is usually set to 128 megabytes. Just bump that up, like I doubled it to 256. I also bumped up my max execution time. This is usually 30 seconds, but I left it up to 60 seconds because, again, MAMP it runs slower than a typical server out there. That should keep you from some errors like timeout and server errors during updates and things like that. So now that we have that all configured, let's go to the hosts and we'll add a host here. I use craft.test all the time, and we'll point it to the desktop here in this folder we downloaded at the web root. And we will create a database, craft_test, because I just like to name it that way. And we'll save it. And it'll ask us if we want to restart the servers here in a second. And boy, howdy, we do. Perfect. We'll wait for MySQL to start up here before we move along. All right, let's see what the next step is here. We'll run the setup wizard. Now, there are two setup wizards. Obviously, if you're doing terminal setup with Composer, then you would do this command on the terminal, but we're not doing that. So we'll skip down here to the web browser setup. In the browser, we'll go to our hostname and then /index.php, p equals admin. Notice that since I'm running Apache and MAMP will respect Apache's this htaccess file, once I put that in the browser, it's going to redirect me to like a pretty URL without that index.php. Let's go ahead and open up a new tab here, go to Craft CMS or Craft.test. Actually, let's look at the website. Just want to let you know that this is a perfectly normal and acceptable error. We haven't installed Craft yet, so of course we're going to have a server error. So let's go to the path that the instructions recommended, and it rewrites to admin/install, but we have a database connection error. Now this is, let me show you what the date is today. It's June 1st, 2018, and this is a bug, or at least it deviates from the instructions. So let's look. The instructions say that along the way, it's going to ask me for my database credentials, but that's not the case. It's already trying to connect to the database and complaining that it can't. So no worries. We'll just go set that up manually. And the place to do that is in the .env file. And like I said, I'll explain more about this file later. I will change the syntax coloring to bash so it looks a little nicer, easier to read. And the DB server is localhost. That works well. The user is root. And for MAMP, the default MySQL user database password is root. The database is the one we just created, craft_test. This doesn't apply to MySQL. I'll choose not to use the database table prefix, and the port, because I chose standard ports here under ports 3306, then it'll fall back to 3306. So I don't have to put anything in here if I don't want to, and I won't. Now, if you're using the default ports, you would use 8889. All right, so everything looks good, and that should solve the problem here. We'll just refresh. And here we see the installation screen. So I'm going to go ahead and go through this process real quick. And we'll give it a minute to install. Great, that's about it for walking through the installation. Now, if you want to stick around, I'd like to explain the multi-environment configuration that's different between Craft 2 and Craft 3. It used to be in Craft 2 that you would, here, this is the Craft 2 documentation. Let's look at the database one because that's where we started. That's all we've put in right now. So it used to be that you would put .test as like the end of the URL or the end of the host name, pardon me, like this .test. It would recognize that. And then this would be the username, password, and everything for the database. And then .com is most likely the production server. So your production credentials will go in here. Now, there's a couple problems with this, and I've dealt with this before on certain projects where multiple devs are working on it, and we all had to agree on what the username password should be for our personal databases locally. And it's just a waste of time to set that all up. So you end up arguing over the credentials in this right here. And also, you don't want to put the production credentials in a file that might accidentally be visible publicly. It's just not like best practices. Obviously, you don't want that information visible anywhere. So the idea is that these database credentials live in your .env file. And whatever you set here then becomes available in the PHP environment that PHP is running in. And you can pluck these in any PHP script. So let's go look at the db.php, which we didn't touch. And if you're coming from Craft 2, that might feel a little awkward. But the idea here is that this file will never change. And you use this file or this function here called getenv, and then pass it the key of the environmental variable that you set in this file. So of all these that we set here within the db.php file, we're just plucking those out of the environment and giving them to Craft. What that allows you to do is to not include this .env file in your Git repository. In fact, Craft gives you a git ignore file to start with that ignores that file. That way, I can put in whatever credentials I want locally. And then if my workmate is using like Homestead or another system, they can put in DB user Homestead and password secret, and there's no fighting. And the other thing this does too is that on the production server or on the staging server, these files only live within that context, and nobody needs to know what the production credentials are outside of the actual production server. So there's a level of safety there. Well, that explains the purpose of the .env file, but let's look at the general config now for multi-environments. Again, it used to be that you would say like .test and .com or something like that. And let's look up here at the general settings where you would actually put in the entire host name if you wanted to. In Craft 3, it's just a little different in that the environments are named a little more semantically. We have dev, staging, and production. Really, the only one that matters is production. The rest are very subjective. They can be whatever you want them to be. For instance, in the .env file, I've set this environment variable to dev. So in this general configuration, it's going to look for this dev part right here, and it'll turn dev mode on. So if we look at the control panel of what we just installed, we do see the yellow line at the top. And I can change that then for staging. On your staging server, you would change it to staging. And if I refresh, dev mode should go away because staging is not set in the staging part right here. Now, if there's nothing, it will fall back to production. And the reason for that, now, if this is information overload, skip, you don't listen to this part. But if you go to the index.php file, here on line 19 is where the Craft environment gets set. And it first tries to see if there's any value set for that environment. Remember, this plucks the environment value out of the PHP environment and assigns it here. But if it doesn't exist or it's empty, then it will fall back to the literal word production right there. So that's why in your general config, production is a good one to keep for your production. Now, say I don't like dev because it's not descriptive. What I really want is for it to be local, because it's my local machine and that makes more sense to me. Well, that's totally fine. Just go change that to local here, go into your .env and change this to local. And now you're back in business. And I think you can see the power in this. Like you could use some logic to set many different staging environments, like not just limited to the URL. I could even define multiple environments that run on my local machine and just swap them out when I need to by changing the key right here. So that's it on multiple environment configurations and the purpose of the .env file. I hope that this was really helpful, and I hope that you have fun with Craft.